Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by the good people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas.
This week's episode comes about from a post that somebody made on Words and Numbers Backstage on Facebook.
Which you should join.
Yeah, there are, last count, I think 1,600 people there. Some of them, well, I would imagine a lot of them read what's there but don't contribute. There's a bunch that do contribute, some quite a bit, some periodically. But there was a conversation that went on between us and basically four members, Chad Williams, Brendan Eck, Guy Higgins, and Luke McCormick. And I'm not going to identify what each of the individuals said, but it was an interesting conversation centered around this question we decided to go ahead and do a whole episode on. But what prompts it is the more generic question that James and I have asked in the past: do we owe each other something?
Well, let's be fair. We ask, what do we owe each other? Which actually implies an answer.
Yeah, yours implies a number as opposed to a yes-no.
It implies an answer, right? You don't ask, what do we owe each other, unless we owe each other something. If you ask, do we owe each other something? Well, nothing is no, right? That's a possible answer. But I don't think that's a possible answer. I don't think there's any way you can slice this up and have that be the answer. And I can hear the anarcho-capitalists howling already, but they can howl away. That's what they do best. When you get right down to it, we're really talking about what social life is, what social living is, and if it brings with it costs of some kind. And I think we all know for a fact that it does. So then the obvious follow-up question, where I part company with the anarcho-capitalists, is in answering this second question. Okay, there are costs associated with living socially. How do we pay them? The anarchists will always say some kind of usage fee, and then we don't have to worry about the human element of you dealing with me and me dealing with you and the two of us dealing with others.
But before we get into the details, this question, do we owe each other something? Or how did you phrase it? What do we owe each other? The question that comes, I guess, alongside this, and they're related, which is the actual question somebody posted, is taxation theft? And I hear so many libertarians just kind of, without even thinking it through, saying, well, of course, taxation is theft because it's money the government takes from you. And I point out, well, hang on, the claim that taxation is theft implies an answer to your question, James. And the answer is no, we don't owe each other anything. But if we do owe each other something, then actually the absence of taxation is theft.
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far, but I appreciate the sentiment. I'll tell you this. In the pre-revolutionary period, in what became the United States, there were arguments leveled against Parliament that indicated that the colonists thought that taxation, specifically the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, things like that, were in fact theft. They said it out loud, they said it repeatedly. And then they fought the English, a revolution or a civil war, depending on which perspective you take, and against literally all odds. There was almost no chance of this outcome occurring. They won. What did they do the minute they had a constitution? Taxes.
Right.
Right? Because in the end, if you want to have a functioning government, you have to tax. Now, what you tax and to what degree you tax, these are open questions.
Now, people are going to come back and say, well, but you can have a government by, what is the term, voluntarism.
Yeah, no, you can't.
Yeah, well, we tried that with the Articles of Confederation, where the states would voluntarily give money to the federal government, and nothing happened.
And that was only voluntarism of 13 entities.
Right, yes, not 300 million, yeah.
Because inside those states, there was no such animal.
Yep.
They were acting as states always do. But I mean, I don't want to get too personal about it, but you were once an anarchist.
Oh, yeah, and I still believe in anarchism. I just don't think it's practical currently.
And might never be, right, given this problem of human nature. Mm-hmm. It might be because there's this other thing, human evolution, and we'll see. But as the chips lie right now, No. And the point I wanted to get to, you're a former anarchist who still has deep anarchist leanings. And I think I've never been an anarchist, but I've always been a minarchist. And I also have deep anarchist leanings. Why? Because I think the answer to most every problem doesn't involve let's have government do it.
Yep.
If you can't take me at my word there and then think through the things I've already thought through for 30 years, well, I don't know what to tell you. But I've thought a lot of things through, and they don't add up when you start talking about anarchism. And they don't add up because I don't think the answer to the formative question here, what do we owe each other, I don't think the answer to that is nothing. I think if we're going to live socially, if we're going to live together in communities, certain expenses come from that.
Now, I think a couple of people said on Backstage that, well, we owe each other to leave each other alone, to respect each other's property rights. That's a passive owe.
I agree, but that's not what we're asking.
But when we talk about owe, we mean in an active sense. You actively owe somebody, that you need to be doing something.
Yeah, you got to write a check at the end of the year.
Right.
And people will say, well, look, everybody's on his own. Well, all right. What about these roads we got to build? I know it's a trite thing, and everybody says who's going to build the roads, but I don't get a particularly good answer to the question, who's going to build the roads?
I wouldn't even go to the roads. I think you gave what I considered the most compelling argument once when you said, look, we believe that there are property rights and they should be enforced.
Yep.
And what do you do when someone violates your property right? You need a system, you need some impartial person. This is the judge. Even before that, you need to clarify what the rights are. That requires a Congress. And then somebody's got to go out and arrest the guy or force him to make right for whatever violation he committed. That requires an executive branch. And all of that's got to be paid for.
There's two arguments that come against that line of thought from the anarchist leading among us. They'll say, first, we don't need courts. What we need is an adjudicator, and people can agree to go to a private adjudicator. And we do this now.
Sure.
But the problem with that, alternate resolution, ADR, it's all the rage everywhere because you can get your case heard quickly, get a clear answer, and move on. In a lot of instances, both parties pay less, even though one loses and one wins.
Right, yeah.
Because it takes all the lawyers out of it for the most part, and you don't have to work it through the courts for 8 years before you get an answer. So I get it. I'm in favor of this. This is a great idea. But both parties have to walk in voluntarily. And when my neighbor violates my property rights, I'm dragging him in.
Yes, the reason they walk in voluntarily is because there's the threat that you would drag him in to the regular court system otherwise.
And they're not going to ADR unless they both think they have a legitimate chance of prevailing.
Yep.
Criminals don't think that way. They know they won't prevail in a court. The last thing they want to do is go someplace and see a judge there. You have to actually force them to go, which means not only do you need a court and a legislative body to enunciate the law, you're also going to need probably sheriffs and police officers. You're probably going to need something along the lines of a jail. Stop me when it starts becoming obvious, right? There are all kinds of things that when we say we need this one thing, all right, well, you can't have this one thing unless you have these 75 other things.
One of the people in this conversation said, and I'm sympathetic to this argument, that the market can handle so much of this and does through mutual aid societies, charity, nonprofits. And I grant, and I'm sure you would, all of that.
I do.
But the question is, what happens to the cases that fall between the cracks, right? We're not arguing here that government should be doing wall to wall, all this stuff. But we are arguing that there's a slice that we think the government's going to have to do.
Yeah, it's an insurer of last resort in this respect, right?
Yeah.
You talk about the social safety net and people resort to platitudes pretty quickly. Well, private entities will spring up and take care of that, and they do to a point. But when I worked in Connecticut, and I'm going to say a word that I'm not allowed to say anymore, but this was the name of the organization I worked for. I worked for the Connecticut Department of Mental Retardation, and I worked in a mental institution, and people would kind of sheepishly come up and knock on the door. And they would say, I can't take care of my brother anymore. What do I do? And then I would say, well, there's a waiting list, but it's probably 5 or 6 years long. There are private agencies that have group homes, and their waiting lists are 8 to 12 years long. Or you can abandon him here right now. And people said, I can't abandon my brother. And I said, well, if you abandon him, I have no choice but to take him in.
Yeah.
And they would say, meet my brother.
Yeah.
Right? And that was a person who didn't have any place to go and who didn't have the wherewithal to get his own place and never would. Now, are you willing to say some people just have to die outside in the cold? If you're willing to say that, okay, you're consistent in your principles. You're also a pig of a human being, because a good and decent society takes care of those who cannot take care of themselves. And notice the words I said. I didn't say who don't want to take care of themselves. I didn't say who refuse to take care of themselves. I said those who cannot take care of themselves. And there are any number of people, more than you would think, who actually fit that description to a T. So the question becomes, do we owe something to them? Because they are part of us.
Right.
They are part of each other. And I can't see a way in which a humane society can say no. And it's odd, right? Because we look at poor countries around the world and we see, the disabled among them living in the streets. And as those countries become wealthier and wealthier, what do we see? The first thing countries do when they finally have some money is they start taking care of people who are formerly kicked out into the street.
Right.
Right? They do this all the time. I'm not talking about totalitarian states. I'm talking about relatively liberal, relatively Western countries.
Well, as you say this, a thought occurs to me. You're talking about us owing, and I'll paraphrase, we owe those who can't take care of themselves. And this is after private charity is doing everything it can. And now picture the people who can't take care of themselves falling through the cracks. We owe them something by virtue of their being human.
Well, I think there's two things. I think, yes, it's by virtue of our shared humanity on the one hand, and by virtue of our shared citizenship on the other.
Yeah, I don't want to go there yet, but the claiming that we owe it to these people by virtue of our shared humanity or their humanity, that argument, it's ringing a bell. That's the argument we make for natural rights.
Yes.
That you have rights by virtue of your status as a human being.
It's the Jeffersonian formulation.
And that's kind of interesting that those two, our obligation and our rights, would have, in some sense, the same core, the same root.
Yeah, I think it does. And notice I wanted to hook citizenship to that pretty quickly, because if I don't, then everybody has the obligation to support people everywhere all the time.
I don't know. Maybe we do.
No, we don't. We absolutely don't. And we don't because other people in other places are largely suffering, not always, but largely suffering because of the poor decisions that they made, not as individuals per se, but as individuals who are also part of a collective, right? So year after year after year, you make lousy decisions and lousy policies, and then everybody's hungry at the end. In Venezuela right now, of course they're all hungry. Of course they are. That's their fault. And that matters.
I don't know.
You have to decide how far responsibility goes. The anarchists say responsibility exists in and only in the individual. And I'm saying no, it's more profound than that. It extends to the larger community. How large a community becomes the question. We're going to have an attachment to our locality, to our state, and to our nation.
But you've broken the link that I just was making between the fact that we owe people something because by virtue of their being human. I'm linking that to natural rights, which we have by virtue of our being human. Taking your argument, there would be in other countries maybe people who don't have natural rights.
No, in other countries right now, there are people who are not enjoying their natural rights. If you take a good long look, well, let's pick a country out of the air. Iran, where a woman is being beaten because she had the nerve to sing a song online without covering her hair. Now, her rights are being abused, something awful.
Oh, they're being abused, but she still has them.
Right, she has them. There's nothing we're going to do about it.
Okay, fair enough. You will agree she has these natural rights by virtue of her being human.
Of course I do, but she's outside of whatever boundary we've decided we have control over. We can't do anything about that. We're sorry. That's up to the Iranians to fix, or maybe more likely the Israelis.
Yeah, in terms of her rights. Now, what if she's starving by no fault of her own? Do we have an obligation to her?
No, and not a political obligation. You might have a moral obligation that is far, far greater than any political obligation you might have. And this is why people give money to children in foreign countries all the time.
Well, this is interesting. You just made a distinction I have not been making between political and moral obligation. When I'm talking about what we owe each other, do we owe each other something? I'm speaking from a moral perspective.
It's a moral question in its nature, right? Right down to its marrow, it's a moral question. But it's immediately followed by, and where does that apply? As an American, I'm not going to say that anything I decide applies in Ethiopia. That's for the Ethiopians to decide. Now, there are times throughout human history where I would have been an interventionist had I been alive. If you had shown me concentration camps in World War II, I would have said, well, all right, fire up the tanks, we're going. Because that's just beyond the pale. Right. But if you showed me what was going on in the former Yugoslavia, I wouldn't have been as quick to do it. Were there still gross violations of human rights in Yugoslavia? Yes. But it wasn't of the same rank. And that matters, right? Anything outside of our boundaries, we play by different rules out there. If I was seeing something in Texas that was even 1/1000th as bad as I was seeing in Europe in 1940, I would say we need to get to Texas right now because that's us. That's our own. And different rules apply when it's us. And that matters, right? How you define us matters. And how you define us matters when you answer the question, do we owe each other those two pronouns, right?
Okay, so I'm going to try and make your argument here. I can buy that argument that things change when we're talking about people in foreign countries. And I'm going to argue that that's the case because, to a great extent, we have to respect their right of self-determination. And if they have chosen a brand of government that's giving them these outcomes, that's...
Even if they haven't, right? If they've acquiesced to a government.
Right.
Right. I say this often, and I don't think people hear me for what it really means. I always say sooner or later, people are responsible for their governments.
Yeah.
They take that in a very typically Western or United States sort of way. But I mean that about the North Koreans, too. Right? If you let it slide for long enough, that's on you. Would it be nearly impossible to overthrow the yoke of Kim Jong-il right now? Yeah, probably.
Really? I was going to say the other way. It should be pretty easy.
No, not with the military he's got. But sooner or later, you have to look at what's gone on and say, well, you know, we did this. We allowed this to happen. He went and took it. Well, his father went and took it. But despots have been doing that since human beings first walked the earth. So I'm not terribly surprised by that. I am surprised that nobody can realize the level of responsibility that incurs.
I want to go back to the question of what we owe each other, because you went, and I think it's fine to go there, to the question of, well, we need governmental infrastructure to protect the very rights that we're claiming are so important. Something different occurred to me from my time in Spain, where I can't speak the language. There are subtleties to the social interactions that I don't get. And it occurred to me, you know, this thing that's so fundamental, you can't operate in society. Forget about society. You can't even operate within the economy well if you don't speak the same language that everybody else speaks. And that's just given to me. This invaluable thing is given to me for free. And where did it come from? It spontaneously erupted from our society over time. In a very real sense, the language is a gift from society without which I can't function. And add to that the mores, the social, behaviors. That to me represents something tangible I have received at zero cost. That by rights, if you want to go to the full anarchist image of all sacrosanct property rights, by all rights I should be paying for, and I'm not.
Well, there's a difference, a considerable one, between society and government, right? And we talk about society, and I refer to Tom Paine on this all the time. He said society in every state is a blessing. Government is at best the necessary evil, but it was a necessary evil, according to Paine.
Right.
I think that's exactly right. Society in every instance is in fact a blessing, and the blessings that emerge from it are the things you were just talking about. And I think those things could conceivably come from voluntary interaction. I could see where you might have a very small group of people living on a plot of land somewhere who still somehow manage the blessings of language and certain other things, right? Behavioral mores, like you were talking about. It's when we get into a larger group, and the larger you get, the more impersonal it becomes. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think is lost on a lot of people. Now, it always matters closer to home. So I deal with things here in Tucson, Arizona, and you deal with things there functionally in the DC metro area. And then we each deal with things that are more national in scope. But because of my proximity to the Mexican border, I deal with things just over that border. Those mm-hmm. things matter to us here. And they don't matter to you at all. Why would they? Mm-hmm. Right? They don't matter to us nearly as much 5 feet over the border as it does 5 feet on the other side. Mm-hmm. Why not? Because this is our side, populated by us. That's their side, populated by them. And us and them, that doesn't have to be pejorative. That's just us and them. And we could get along famously. And I think we generally do with the Mexicans, contrary to what you hear coming out of Trump's mouth most of the time. Here in Tucson, when they say the Mexicans are coming, we say, God, I hope they bring more tacos. We love tacos, right? And it just so happens we don't mind Mexicans either. Mm-hmm. Weekly, I am in a store in which I'm the only English speaker. No big deal, right? There's a way to get by with that. And that's, I think, the biggest lesson I took from Iraq. The day I got left there, I walked in my apartment and I found a little box of cookies and some instant coffee. And I thought, I haven't eaten in 24 hours. Better get somewhere. Some people have heard me tell this story, but I was able to go outside, hail a cab, pay for the cab with American money, tell the cab driver to stay put while I walked into the grocery store, did my grocery shopping, paid that with American money, got back to the cab, went back to my apartment, and back upstairs and in where I cooked my first meal in a couple of days, all without speaking a word of the language. Mm-hmm. All right, there's something about human beings that allows us to communicate even when we don't really communicate. You could drop me anywhere in the world and I can find a way to ask for a cup of coffee, right? It's just not that hard. And most other people can do that too. And there is something about our shared humanity that I think is incredibly important. And I think people overlook that. But the obvious question is, what's it all worth to you? And here, you and I have done some research on this such that it is. And by research, I don't mean we've done extensive opinion polling. I mean, we've asked probably at this point thousands of people. If we do owe each other something, that means we're going to have taxes. What percentage of your income do you think would be fair? That's the perfect question to ask, right? Because it allows everybody to tell you exactly what they think we owe each other. And there's an overwhelmingly correct answer to this question.
Yeah, it's surprising. They come in around about 20%, plus or minus.
There's a few that are at 15. There's a couple of jack at 0. There's a few at 25. There's a couple of Marxist fools at 100. And the vast majority of everybody else lands right on 20.
Yep.
And they land right on it.
Not only do they land on it, but if you break it down, as I have, by income level, and what should the poor pay, and the middle class, and the one percenters, it's also pretty consistent in their opinions. It runs roughly 5% for the poor, 10-15% for the middle class, and 30% for the 1%. In all sorts of ways. And by the way, that matches, roughly speaking, our current tax code.
Roughly speaking.
Yeah. Oh, and the total income, right, that the government collects is about 18% of the economy. So also, yeah, where we're off is on our spending, but our tax code is hitting where people think it should.
Yeah, more or less, it's hitting it straight on the nose. But the interesting thing is when regular people are asked, they all think the poor should pay income tax.
Yeah, yeah.
The only people who don't think that are politicians and the poor. Everybody else thinks, hey, get some skin in the game. You won't be poor for long.
I want to go back to something I proposed earlier. When people say taxation is theft, and I push back on them, they come back, and it came up in this group discussion, that taxation is theft because the individual has their money taken from them by force. And I try to point out to people that that statement itself implies that we don't owe each other anything. And I want to go back to this because my claim is, if it is the case that we do owe each other something, let me just pick a number out of the air, 20%. We each owe each other 20% of what we earn. Then if you aren't paying that 20%, you have property that belongs to the rest of us. And if we don't take it by force, that's a violation of the property. In other words, our property rights are already being violated. The way to rectify it is to take it by force.
I'm sympathetic to this argument too. And really, the only open question I have is what the correct answer is. Now, I know most people will say 20%. I think it's actually quite a lot lower. Mm-hmm. But that's me. And this is, again, something we would have to decide together.
And I think it's one of the places that libertarians go off the rails. When they start saying taxation is theft, the implication, whether they're aware of it or not, is that we don't owe each other anything. And I think that's patently false. The question of what should the taxes be, that's a separate question.
Yeah, a good question. A very good question.
I'll have people come to me saying, oh, no, we don't owe each other anything. Look at how high the taxes are. That's a separate issue.
Yep, apples and Pontiacs.
Right, yeah.
Not even apples and oranges.
Yeah, so begin here. Do we owe each other anything? If the answer is yes, okay, then let's move on and try and figure out what that might be.
And if the answer is no, are you willing to live with the ramifications of that answer?
Yeah.
Because there are ramifications to that answer. I don't think they yield a post-apocalyptic hellscape like you would see, say, in Kevin Costner's magnum opus, The Postman. God, what a garbage movie that was. But it's not livable either. So what is it that you want? You know, there's this thing early on in Plato's Republic. The young men are gathered round. This is a nice way to end. With Socrates at a table. And they're trying to found a city in speech. They want to design the perfect city. And they say, oh, it's real easy. You have some farmers and a guy who makes shoes. And, you know, you trade shoes for farming produce and this kind of thing. And there you go. Perfect. And then one guy says, well, what about relishes? And what he says in standard American English is, what the hell kind of life is that? Is that the kind of life you want? You could probably have it. But God, isn't there so much more? And how do we get there? Well, I think you just put human beings together and take your hands off of them, and they do remarkable things. But in the end, they don't do everything. They don't do a couple of necessary things that simply must get done. We can talk about it in the way we have, which kind of centers around social things, or we could talk about military things, if that would be someone's preference. Machiavelli in the 16th century wrote that if you're relying on mercenaries for your military, you will be beaten because they don't have a devotion to your plot of land. They have a devotion to the money they're getting, and it's not worth their lives. It's just not. But they'll leave. The first time they think they're going to get killed, they're out the door.
Yeah.
So if you just don't care that some people are going to shiver cold until they die, well, maybe you care that the Canadians will come streaming over the northern border without an adequate force to repel them. Everywhere you look, there's another problem when you rely solely on a forceless society, which is why the founders of the United States tried very hard to make a government that would be incredibly powerful in the things it could do, but would be limited in the things it could do. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.